there are no compromises with people like Vladimir Putin. We've tried to compromise with him, the invasion of Georgia, the annexation of Crimea. This only ends one way unless you push somebody back. Putin and his forces need to be roundly defeated, humiliated even, to make sure that he doesn't even think, or him or his successors, of attempting this anywhere again.
Are you at all concerned that when it comes to international support for Ukraine, there is a bit of war weariness creeping in?
No, I think we've got to be mindful and not get too carried away. I think you're probably alluding to some of the comments we've heard from America, from the US. They're in a period where there's potentially an open election prospect at the end of the year. They're going through the primary process. So we're seeing posturing and people saying things which perhaps don't really translate into a real change of policy, which hasn't happened.
So, as you've mentioned the United States, of course, what has happened there is we had this last-minute deal to get a budget through, but it left out the question of future funding for more military support for Ukraine. You sound quite relaxed about that. That's quite worrying, isn't it?
Well, it is a thing of concern, but you have to keep it in perspective, and I think it's fairly short-term. I don't think the position of the United States has changed. Having said that, I am in the process of organising a delegation of members of Parliament to go to the US in the next few weeks or a month or so to talk to congresspeople, maybe on the Republican side more than the Democratic side, to say, the Ukrainians are fighting our war for freedom and democracy, and if we don't push Putin right out of Ukraine, including the Crimea, I think the cost could be far greater in the future.
You've got the very real prospect that Donald Trump could not only get the Republican nomination, he's way ahead of the rest of the field, but could be the next president of the United States. Do you fear that a future President Trump might not be prepared to continue providing the sort of vital support which the US has been providing for Ukraine?
Well, I don't know what's going to happen in the American elections. Of course, it's a possibility that Donald Trump could get the nomination and win the election, but that's a matter for the American people. But I think when you actually look at where we are and the geopolitical consequences of Putin even seeking to claim success or any reward for what he's done, I think sanity will prevail.
We've got Russia gearing up to carry out emergency drills for a possible nuclear strike. What do you make of this? Is this just more of Putin flexing his muscles, or do you think we should be really concerned about the sort of tactics he could resort to?
Well, I think with Putin you have to be ready for anything, but I'm minded to think actually this is saber-rattling and posturing for his own people and his own position and his own audience. I think Putin understands that if he were even to deploy a small tactical battlefield nuclear weapon, the whole dynamic would change and the consequences for him would be catastrophic.
Are you concerned that as the war drags on and we've had this counter-offensive which has made some small gains but no really significant breakthroughs yet, that the suffering that the Ukrainian people are going through, and indeed the need to continue to support the country which you clearly support, that becomes less of a priority for the government here?
No, I don't think in any way, shape or form. And I think what the Ukrainians have managed to do so far without air superiority, without being able to massively bombard the minefields from the air, the fact they've managed to break through slowly and incrementally is actually astonishing. If you look at the conflicts we've been engaged in, both of the Gulf Wars, even going back to Overlord and Normandy, we've always relied on air superiority and the ability to clear a path for ground forces, and they're having to do that with long-range missiles and doing it inch by inch, mile by mile, and I'm astonished that they've done as well.
Boris Johnson, in the early days of the war, forged a very strong personal rapport with President Zelensky, and indeed has continued to visit the country and to speak out to try to rally support behind Ukraine. You haven't really had the same kind of emphasis and priority given to the issue by Rishi Sunak, have you?
Well, I'm not sure that's true. We've pledged for even more military and financial support next year. I carried a message because I was in Ukraine at the weekend, came back I think it was late Sunday evening, it all blurs a bit. And I had a message from the President's office that, they'd love to welcome our Prime Minister back in Ukraine before Christmas. So I think that relationship is strong. I think given what the Secretary of State for Defence said last night at our reception, the Ukrainians are hugely grateful of what we're doing, and I think we will continue to do that and build on those links. And the leadership, in fairness, which Boris showed. I mean, he led the Western world as far as the support for Ukraine right at the beginning, when everything was up in the air and we didn't really know how it was all going to pan out.
Yeah, but we haven't seen the same sort of approach from Rishi Sunak. I'm struggling to remember when he last even mentioned Ukraine. It's not one of his priorities. It's not up there on his admittedly very crowded agenda, is it?
Well, I think, on the contrary, he has made many statements in the House of Commons. The FCO team and the defence team have too, and we've pledged to increase our support to Ukraine by even more next year. So I'm comfortable and happy that the Prime Minister is full square behind the Ukrainians, and we're committed and we're there and we're leading the charge.
But don't we need him to be really showing some leadership on this? Because if he's not talking about it, if he's not stressing the importance of it globally, then you're not going to get the same sort of international alliance continuing, are you?
I think he is, and he has, and I think you'll find on tomorrow when he makes his speech that there'll be I'm sure, and I haven't read it, I haven't spoken to anybody in his team, I'm sure there'll be strong references for what we're doing in Ukraine, and we'll continue to support the Ukrainian people in their fight, and they're fighting our war. If Putin's allowed to even portray any of that as a victory, there'll be escalation, he'll try again, and we all know what the consequences could be of that.
We are, of course, spending quite a bit of extra money to provide Ukraine with the training, the weapons, the other supplies that we're sending. Do we need to increase our military spending in order to maintain that?
Well, we've done everything we possibly can so far. We've increased the defence budget domestically. We've increased the amount of money we've pledged to help the Ukrainians. And I've been 4 times this year already, hoping to go at least once more before the end of the year. And the Ukrainians have got nothing but fulsome praise of what we've done diplomatically, politically, militarily. I mean, we've trained tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers in our country. So, I'm proud of what we've done, frankly, and what we are doing.
When you're there most recently, what were you most struck by in terms of the mood amongst the Ukrainian people?
Well, it's contrasting between when I go and visit and have meetings in Kiev and when I went to the Frontline south of Zaporizhzhia, I think it was the end of July. There's a great sense of, in the cities, almost a defiance to continue to have life as normal as possible despite the air raid warnings, the bunkers and the drone strikes. But what really moved me was seeing the cheerfulness and adversity which the troops on the ground on the front line, using our kit, most of which I spoke to were gunners who've been trained in the UK. Great morale, great comradeship, and it was I was inspired and moved by that.
You spoke at the beginning of this interview about the importance of pushing Russian troops out of all of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, which of course they have occupied since before the most recent invasion. Are you concerned that given what appears to be something of a stalemate in the front lines when we look at what is happening, that there will come a point when there will be pressure for Ukraine to compromise, to accept a loss of some territory in return for peace?
Well, there isn't a stalemate. Advances are being made, breakthroughs have been made, and given, as I said earlier, what they don't have, I think they've done astonishingly well. This conflict started in 2014. It didn't start 18 months ago. Putin cannot be allowed to get away by keeping 1 inch of Ukrainian soil, because that's a deterrent for the future. It's a message to the rest of the world. Don't forget, we've got the Iranians and the Chinese and the North Korea just looking at what we are doing there as a Western country and as a Western bunch of nations. We saw what happened in Afghanistan when we were humiliated and left chaos behind and give the country back to the Taliban. We cannot allow to project that weakness again, because all it will do is encourage Putin and people like him to continue to push the boundary, to think that they can walk into somebody else's country and do what they like.
You talked there about the Ukrainians making gains, and they have made some gains, and they have retaken some of the towns that have been occupied by the Russians. But there are still significant chunks of Ukrainian territory under Russian occupation. Those gains have come at a terrible, terrible cost. And do you not accept that there's going to come pressure, and we're already seeing it from some European states, who are looking ahead to seeing what compromises might possibly be needed in order to bring about an end to the conflict?
They need aircraft, they need more long-range weapons, and they need more support. There are no compromises with people like Vladimir Putin. We've tried to compromise with him. The invasion of Georgia, the annexation of Crimea. This only ends one way unless you push somebody back. Putin and his forces need to be roundly defeated, humiliated even, to make sure that he doesn't even think, or him or his successors, of attempting this anywhere again.
Jack Lopresti, thank you very much. Before you go, though, I do just want to ask you about the Home Secretary's speech today. She talked about a hurricane of immigration, about millions of people wanting to come to this country. Those comments are pretty inflammatory, aren't they?
Well, I didn't see it because I was chairing my Ukrainian roundtable with defence contractors and a government minister. I'm very proud to live in a very tolerant country. We've always welcomed people from overseas. We've always looked after genuine asylum seekers and people who are escaping the ravages of war-torn countries and things like that. So I'm proud that we live in a country